good afternoon. Welcome to the Policy Working Group introduction session. I'm Zhipeng Huang from Huawei. I'm currently leading a standard and open source team within Huawei.
I'm Michael Elder. I'm with IBM as part of the IBM Cloud Private team.
Hi, I'm Erica. I'm on the security OpenShift team at Red Hat.
Okay, we three will give this presentation of the, I think, pretty new working group. We just established around February, I think, in Kubernetes. So, motivation. So, why are we doing this, right? I think if you have participate in Kubernetes, you can find many places that are policy related. So the most mentioned examples are RBACs, right? You need policies for admission control and all that stuff. But we find that the policy features in Kubernetes is actually scattered around the place. You have network policy on the networking side. You have RBAC on the authentication side, and many other features. It will be very difficult for people that just get into Kubernetes or users, to try to have a overview, high-level overview of the holistic policy picture for Kubernetes. So that's actually one of the main motivation for us to do this working group. And also other things, for example, like the item number 3 here. So do we have or do we need a unified policy language, or we could offer different language for different purposes, and and for different role, and what are the impact, and what are the functionalities that a policy-related functionalities are needed. So these are the questions that we ask ourselves before we establish the working group. So warning, there will be a lot of cats on the slides.
Can I jump in real quick? Yeah. The theory is policy is important, but not necessarily the most exciting. So on some slides, there'll be an animated cat GIF just to help keep you in it. This is the herding cats GIF, hence the mission of a broader policy work group.
Yeah. So from the very beginning of the discussion around the working group, we want to be absolutely clear that we want to avoid to reinvent the wheel or redefine many things that the community has agreed upon and developed, great features. We don't want to do that, jump in and say, hey, we have a better solution. And we want to provide an overall architecture that describes how policy works and the policy architecture in Kubernetes. And we want to be able to capture both the current, many of the current development, as well as we can propose some great features and make it into Kubernetes. So a little bit history. So we actually kicked off the discussion, offline discussion between David here and Torren from OPA and Clayton and those people last year. And so around the time of KubeCon North America that held frozen Austin last year, we decided to to go into public and make this a absolutely community effort. So I think we officially formed in early January and officially approved on February, and we have been having the weekly meeting ever since. So I have to try to not to miss any meetings and keep a tight pace so that everyone participate in the working group have a sense of like project development, not just someplace you come over and talk. And yeah, so now we have a wide variety of companies participating, like Google, Huawei, IBM, Red Hat, all these great companies. And some interesting facts. So we have been very actively collaborate with all the possible related SIGs working group or projects. For example, with SIG Auth and SIG architecture, and hopefully in the future, SIG network and many other working group and projects. And we have a community-driven approach, meaning everything should be done through open discussion and everything is open design. We don't biased upon certain solutions from certain company. So we want this to be a totally community-driven. And also, just as I mentioned, I'm personally biased toward action. So I want like many of the ideas that we have in the working group could eventually be coded out. So with the help of our colleagues here, we have been having this tight development style of working group discussions. So now we think we have like semi-officially settled upon this half-year cycle marked by the KubeCon events. So which approximately mapped to 2 releases for Kubernetes, so that we could plan and go into implementation for certain releases. Okay, yeah, so Michael will take over here to introduce about the 3 major use cases that we have discovered during the working group discussion.
Thanks, Howard. Appreciate it. So as Howard indicated, we'll talk through sort of 3 use cases. So this is the challenge cat GIF, right? This is the battle that we have to overcome. How do you take such a broad problem of policy across Kubernetes and come up with a solution that's manageable, where you can contribute value back? So we wanted it to be very use case driven. And as we talked among our working group, what were some of the use cases to prioritize? There were 3 that we identified. The first being around compliance and data management, given how prevalent things like GDPR are becoming now, things like PCI and other data standards that have been enforced for many years. If you're running a true enterprise workload in a Kubernetes environment, how can you understand and curate that data and manage it, understand which pieces are subject to compliance laws, which pieces may be restricted into certain geographies, et cetera. So compliance being one of the key first scenarios to tackle. The second one was around capacity. One of the use cases that we thought was interesting out of the KubeCon event in Austin was the HBO team, who presented how they run Kubernetes as part of their organization in order to provide services and capabilities for things like Game of Thrones. And Game of Thrones obviously being a very popular show that occurs on a particular periodic schedule when it's actually released into the HBO streaming services. And their challenge was they had to rapidly scale up and account for that periodic scaling of workload on an ongoing basis. So in terms of capacity management, how could we define more flexible policies that allowed you to maybe trade off capacity to prioritize certain lines of businesses or certain teams within certain windows? How could they actually sort of trade or share capacity among themselves? How would you then recover that quota if it was granted out, right? So how do you really optimize the utilization of your cluster on an ongoing basis and then balance and prioritize across many consumers? And then cluster security is a key aspect that today we see specific implementations for things like pod security policy or network security policy that are spread throughout the platform in different areas. Could we actually establish a common notion of a security profile, for example, to manage all of those aspects? And so in that one, we'll talk through how we might do that with a specific proposal that Eric will take us through at the end. You'll notice some bit.ly links that are down here at the bottom in some of the charts. That's actually where these topics are being discussed. So if you jot them down or download the actual slides, there'll be a link at the end as well. Then you can actually come and join the conversation directly. So we welcome that contribution and that interaction. So compliance, how do you groom your data? How do you manage that for understanding which pieces are subject to regulation and which pieces are subject to audit controls and things of that nature? If you look at GDPR as a foundation, it defines some primary roles as part of the legislation that it's optimizing around. So you've got your data compliance officer, you've got your data controller, and then there's also a data processor who's actually the function which is in carrying out the instructions, right? The compliance officer basically is responsible for defining policy, defining ways to audit and alert when policy is violated. The controller is responsible for actually implementing the policy specification through either manual or automated means, and then the data processor is responsible for carrying out the instructions. So the processor is generally something that we considered more an automated function or a piece of software rather than a human being or a persona. So if you look at the two primary human being personas, we're looking at the data compliance officer and the data processor, or excuse me, the data controller. And in this case, you'll see we've highlighted a couple of use cases. I won't read them all verbatim, but a couple that I'll highlight is really around this capture metrics and ensure that policies are being followed and understand when violations occur. The data controller is responsible for creating the policy, so defining the artifacts that describe how that policy should be enforced, and then measuring the organizational and technical measures for ensuring the security of that data processing. So this scenario, we expect to ultimately result in a set of proposals to improve perhaps how we tag or annotate the utilization of persistent volumes and pods, et cetera, that may interact with sensitive personal information, personally identifiable information, other forms of health data, et cetera. The next scenario here is about capacity, or how to manage demands on your resources. So there's a puppy GIF in case you don't like cats. No? All right. In any case, the capacity management is really, again, about this dynamic quota management. Beyond simply setting a hard limit on how much quota a particular team could consume, how do you balance and trade that off amongst various teams? And so the idea here is to define a set of use cases that allow you to say, for instance, within this window, right, my Game of Thrones example for the HBO team that presented on stage, within this window, Sunday, 9 p.m. Eastern, we actually need to make sure that this particular function or set of services related to Game of Thrones or other video streaming needs to be prioritized for their various requests versus other teams which might be doing more batch processing that is less time dependent. So the idea there is to define a more detailed set of use cases. You'll notice there's summarization here. So there's actually more that's in the document. Again, the document that was linked a moment ago in the first slide about the different scenarios. But here we're looking at things like how to set policies that enable lines of business to lend out unused capacity, how to set capacity allocation that varies by time of day, week, or month, and then how to enable lines of business to be able to set hierarchical policy that divides quota allocation amongst a larger org. So perhaps I have a retail banking org, I allocate a set of quota against my shared services, and they then subdivide it amongst their various teams and business functions. So really this again is about how do you really get the best utilization of your cluster, whether that's in public or private. And in fact, one of these, yes, this one. The other aspect here is how do I specify which teams are entitled to use capacity if I'm in maybe a federated use case on both public resources or private resources. Finally, the keeping intruders out, right? How to prevent them from scaling the walls and getting in. Here, there are great individual components of policy around RBAC, network security policy, pod security policy, et cetera, but managing the life cycle of when to apply those, say as you create new namespaces, is not something that the platform handles out of the box today. So again, in line with the theme, this is not about raising and rebuilding everything that's been established by consensus. It's about incrementally improving how I use it from end to end. So there's a policy that Eric will talk about in just a moment, but ultimately defines a notion of security profile that then groups together a collection of policy and the lifecycle events around it. So these scenarios reflect some pieces that already exist, right? The ability to set RBAC rules, across different namespaces is there today. That's not necessarily new. Isolating network and blocking traffic can be supported today, but then standardizing these policies that account for the life cycle required to apply or modify them, that's something that we think is sort of a net new that would build on top of what's already there. So now we'll get into more of the depth of some of the proposals, and Erica will take us through that. Down, forward, up, back.
Because that makes sense. All right. I kind of joked that I was going to wing this, but that's only half a joke. So we have, I think, several proposals that came to us than or maybe we kind of saw it out as well, where we saw a policy being extended and talked about as like concrete things that people wanted to add into Kubernetes ASAP. That we decided that this is kind of the opportunity to really look at what policy would mean in Kubernetes and start that kind of standardization process, talk about what the semantics are, see if we could have a common understanding for it, as well as help assist, since we had these personas, et cetera, and use cases, and make sure that each of the proposals were fitting in with the actual needs and use cases. So the first one here is scheduling policy. The kind of problem is we have a lot of very fine-grained ways you can control your scheduling. You can add the taints and tolerations, or node affinity or anti-affinity. You have priority classes so that you can say that certain pods have more higher priority over others. You know, make sure you don't kick one of your like logging daemons off of a node just because some new workload comes up, for instance. Or you want to make sure that your master nodes only run the right pods and don't have some user workload scheduled onto them. So while you have all those controls, the problem right now is that it's kind of up to the pod to make sure it has all of the right kind of parts on there, rather than having someone control. So if you like change your label, you might be able to kind of sneak onto the master node, when we do not want that to happen. So the scheduling policy is a way to, with some amount of fine-grained control, say what can and can't be done with these scheduling controls. So for instance, which schedulers can pods in a namespace use? Or which priority classes, perhaps, you know, set aside a set of namespaces that are allowed to have the highest priorities. Any other namespace cannot. Assuming that most basic users don't have the ability to label their namespaces, then by using either just namespaces directly named or namespace selectors, we can control and make sure that these are set correctly. We'll try this out. Okay. This is another one that I think comes to, when I think about policy, it's kind of like the policy when you have a place that you need to make a decision about something, it's the guidelines for making that decision. So you can kind of come and you can see that there are some main points where decisions need to be made in our systems. Scheduling is a very obvious one. Admission control is very obvious if you're like authorized to do something or not. Another one is who can talk to each other and how can they talk to each other. So a natural next place to think about policy is in our topology service policy. This is sort of, we have so many ideas around this kind of being more explicit about the topology of our services to create a framework that integrates well with these service meshes in a more native way. I'm going to have Michael add a little bit.
Sure. So just to build on a little bit of what Erica said, here, as we've thought about most of the policies today, we're restricting behavior of pods, we're restricting network firewalls, et cetera. There's not necessarily a lot of policies that indicate describing behavior about how you want the network flow for a particular service call to be enforced, unless you're bringing a specific service mesh at the application tier. But at the actual infrastructure tier, This proposal is meant to help improve more of the routing behavior. So if I have a particular service that's exposed, this policy would allow me to specify I want to have it serviced by a pod which is closer in locality, a service pod that's providing that API. I want it to be closer to the client. So if a client makes the call, they would actually have the response from a pod that's running on the same host or the same rack or the same data center. If you get into the application layer, you can actually do some of this with things like console. This particular proposal was brought forward, though, to really be able to optimize the per packet routes that are traveling beneath the kube service proxy. And that's really kind of the difference. This is one that we welcome a lot of feedback on exactly whether or not, welcome feedback on whether you think it's viable or whether the community believes that the service management layer that's already there with, say, an Istio or a console or other or Eureka style service discovery frameworks, they already account to a large extent for that kind of locality, but they don't have control or visibility on the packet routes that are actually taken. So you might actually send a packet to a service that is much further away versus being able to identify, no, I want it always to kind of default to the closest pod possible so I can improve latency. So that's really what this one's about. A little bit more low level perhaps, but as you can see, again, the pull request are referenced. We're looking for feedback from you guys. So if it's something that you find you're passionate about one way or the other, please do come and contribute there.
Yeah, all right, and then we have our last one, which is security profile policy. This is sort of a big proposal that encompasses a lot of different ideas. One of them is I think there's a common idea of how can you define a configuration that you can, or maybe not configuration, but describe your cluster when it comes to the policy and its security in a way that is portable across clusters so that you can bootstrap a cluster with the same kind of policy. You can know that when you create namespaces that it's going to have the same kind of policy. How can you check and ensure that some kind of cluster is adhering to a given policy conformance? So it's an active discussion. I think there's a lot of different ideas that we would like some opinion on. You can see here is an example of one aspect, which is the namespace template. This would be when you create new namespaces, want an area to ensure that it's kind of auto-populated with the right controls on it. Things such as RBAC, that's I think probably the biggest one people always think about, or pod security policies, network policies, etc. I think this is a problem that's popped up in quite a few different areas of kind of the more dynamic policy configuration for our clusters. All right. Oh, did you have it? Yeah.
Yeah, so those three proposals are the most mature ones that comes to the working group, and we think those three could be the priorities for us looking towards the 1.12 release. And here are actually other possibilities. So one thing we haven't explained is why we design the way the discussion carrying, why we discuss use cases, and why later on we discuss proposals. It is because we want, through the discussion of use cases, we want to derive the correct requirement for a good policy architecture for Kubernetes. And as you can see, if we thinking back to the three use cases, actually the three proposals mentioned above just cover part of it, and there are other possibilities. For example, Michael and Khalid has some of the prototype for the compliance use case by defining a data control policy, which I think is a pretty awesome idea, that you can actually automate the auditing process rather than having people manually checking it out. And also resource policy, like we have, like in the resource management working group, we have many discussions around the non-native resource management. How do we do that? And there will be also policy related to that, and also the multi-tenant quota. The multi-tenancy working group is currently, as far as I understand, working on a multi-tenant controller. So how the quota policy fit into that architecture and help the quota control is the topic we will be interested in. And there possibly be more to add. So as you can see, the holistic architecture we have been talking about, we don't want to draw that up on the slide using squares, circles. We want it to comes out of the concrete implementation proposals that we could actually code it out, the architecture. So the conclusive architecture will become more and more clear when we have thorough discussions of the specific design proposals. So some of the planning for the second cycle this year for the working group. So I think we will thinking about the construction of the working group structure to enable more people to join the discussion and making the working group more active, and also nomination of the new colleagues to help distribute the task and making the working group more diversified, and work items. So the foremost one is our design document. So all the use cases you have been seeing is documented on the design doc. So we will continue discussion for the design document on the architecture picture, all that stuff, alongside the discussion of the 12 and 13 release top priority PRs. So those three you just saw, and maybe others if people are interested to bring to the working group. And we are also looking at further collaboration within the CNCF community. So maybe some of you already attend the CNCF SAFE working group session earlier today. We have been active collaboration with those folks. And also we are looking at the possibility of CNCF policy working group, because during the discussion, for example, the topology service proposal, the group has been asking the author of the PR, what is the specific relationship between SEO and Kubernetes regarding the topology service. So with Kubernetes becoming a prevailing universal infrastructure for the cloud-native applications, I think we will be needing a cloud-native policy architecture to let user know clearly how things like OPA as a policy engine is still at the microservice mesh and the SPIFFE as the workload security policy spec weave into each other and work with Kubernetes to have a really cloud-native policy-driven architecture. So, and also maybe a possible definition of the container policy interface. For example, how if you have something like OPA, policy engine, how the policy engine talking to the policy enforcement point. So there'll be a lot of very interesting ideas to be discussed. So, and if you are interested, please talk to us, and let's see if we can move on this subject. And again, I'm biased toward action. So if we're gonna have this CNCF policy working group, I also want in this working group to be able to implement any ideas that we will discuss. So tomorrow, I think I have assigned an all-star team that beyond my expectation. So tomorrow, same room, not the same time. later. We'll have the deep dive session, which I invited 6 experts to come over and do lightning talks. Well, it's 5 minutes lightning talk, but that's all like technical, interesting policy implementations. So you have OPA, Istio, Spiffy, Kube Arbitrator, and also SIGAUTH and Kubernetes security profile demo. So please come over tomorrow. There will be like more interesting and amazing things happen tomorrow. Okay. Questions? Thank you.
And just a quick note
about the cat.
Actually, not so much about the cat, but the link underneath it, which hopefully you saw the link as you were looking at the cat, right? Drawing your eye over. Anyway, if you are interested in a copy of the slides, that link will give you a copy. There's all on Google presentation. You can add comments, etc. Questions?
Okay, so you're planning this to be in the main Kubernetes repository, not as a side project, right?
The question is, are we focused on the main security Kubernetes repository or a side project, and we're focused on the main upstream?
Okay, and the next question is for the different, there is like a namespace, and you use the selector and then exclude and then include. Is there a reason why you're not using only selector?
So the question is about the example that was shown.
Because the way all 3 examples there are completely different from how to select which to.
So it's this example. This is simply a snippet of the broader proposal. This is really just describing how they define the matching. But again, if you've got feedback on an alternative, there's a pull request that describes it, and then there's links as well. This actually, I think, is the Google Doc that kind of highlights everything. So either the PR or there and actually provide that feedback. Question I think I saw in the back. Yes.
How should we integrate with policy engine like OPA? How they consider this one month actually? Seems that most of policy engines integrate using webhooks. So if I think that before starting implementation, we need to agree if we are growing this way using webhooks, or maybe have something like a fork of storage line, having something that calls the API with the street
Mm-hmm.
I think that this is a subject that will define the implementation. In your opinion,
So let me see if I can parse out the question. I think the question is, how would something like OPA integrate into this broader story? And would a webhook-centric architecture be the best approach to solve the problems and the scenarios that are presented? If not. So I think this is broader than something I could just answer and give you a definitive answer. I think, in my opinion, I think we haven't really seen how OPA integrates into this yet. We have Torin and others that are helping guide that discussion, and we'll do a lightning talk on that tomorrow. So that may be a question that he will be in a better position to answer specifically. I think in general, the architectural approaches that we see most policy engines follow, typically there's a declaration point, there's an enforcement point, right? And so that enforcement point, having a webhook-centric model that allows you to delegate out is probably reasonable in many cases. I'm hesitant to say that it's the only option in every case. So I tend to think it's going to be on kind of a per usage basis. Like authentication might be a good example that you want to delegate out because your identity providers are always going to be separate. Network security policy may not be something you want to add the opportunity to inject latency because you're worried about optimizing that flow. So I think as we look at that's part of the reason, instead of trying to propose here is the architectural solution that will work for everything, we're really trying to use that use case driven approach and then come up with the right architecture that matches it.
And the container policy interface, the idea of that is exactly as you mentioned. So we are looking at the possibility of to have something SIG storage, SIG network has done to have a API interface rather than a webhook. Yeah, definitely.
Seems like at least part of that problem is specification policy. So users want to specify policy, and then somewhere at the other end there's enforcement, and the source of the enforcement is not necessarily what the user wrote. It might be kind of processed through a few steps to produce whatever's required to enforce it. Is there any discussion up to now, maybe this is possibly the same based on the previous question, but maybe more specifically. So it would seem like some intermediate language might be desirable where irrespective of how you specify your policy, it kind of compiles down to some well-understood specification, which may not be easy to write or easy for everyone to read, but at least it's a commonly understood system. And then ways of enforcing that. Have you had any discussions along those lines?
So if I can summarize the question, I believe it would be something along the lines of, as we have many different descriptions of policy, having a common intermediate language that allows us to represent those intentions that then can be enforced in a consistent engine. Is there a thought process around what that consistent language might be? So I would tend to suggest right now, I think, if there were such a common descriptive language, OPA is probably the starting point because there's already the community effort around it. We have folks like Torin who are active co-leads in the group today. So that tends to be what I would expect it to fall into. You want to add to that?
I would say that one of the things is like, how do you want a Turing complete language for this policy is a large question that we need to discuss, as well as kind of like, you were saying it compiles down. This was something I was thinking about sort of is you can make your policy objects really easy to understand, but that means they might be very difficult to manage or not very actually expressive, or we could have sort of a way that we assume you're going to have tools that would help you compile down to this and make sense of it. But when you read it, it might be almost like ridiculously difficult to figure out exactly which policy is applying. And then we would want tools to be able to even like interpret it and read back. Yeah, these I think are like really difficult questions. Yes. And I think that's kind of the questions that haven't been as discussed in Kubernetes. What is the right, how low level or high level or expressive should these policies be? And if you notice, I'm not giving you a question, just saying that I'm like totally with you that these are the type of things that we're trying to discuss. Most immediately in the scheduling policy, where we want to get a new policy object out within the next couple of releases. So please comment on that, PR.
All right, I think we're at time, just about, so we'll take more questions afterwards. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.